So, Christian, I'd like to hand over to you for your talk this evening. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen here. It is wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I've gone ahead and done a little bit of shameless self-promotion. I apologize by putting this book From Kievan Rus to Ukraine cover up here. This is something I wrote last year, and the material in it is very similar to what I'm going to talk about today. So if there is a situation here where um, you want to know more information, you're looking for some sources, my talk is not footnoted, you can go look in this book or recommend it to others. Andrea, I can't see the chat while I'm sharing my screen, so we might have to wait till the end for questions. I apologize.
If something comes up, Christian, I'll wave my hand at you so that you know there's something's come up.
Thank you, ma'am. All right, so the goal of my presentation tonight is to present the background to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And in many ways, this is deep background, but it's actually highly relevant. And it's important to understand the background because the Ukrainians and Russians do. And it's what motivates them in this particular struggle that they're engaged in. I, of course, am an American. Americans are notoriously bad at history, at remembering history, at understanding historical motivations. You all are much better at that than I am. Every time I go over in the summer to England and I have my English Heritage Pass and I go to sites and, I listen to people talk about things and, whether it's 500 years or 1,000 years, that so much more well-informed. So hopefully this will give you a little bit of a snapshot of a different kind of history, a history in Eastern Europe. There we go. February 24th, 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. So this is the map on the left. You can see this invasion. We're coming up on the second anniversary of this invasion. But in fact, Ukrainians will tell you that it is not the second anniversary of the invasion, it's the 10th. Because in 2014, Russia invaded. The map you'll see on the right, they took the separatist controlled area and they took Crimea from Ukraine. We in the West paid attention. We put in some sanctions. We did little else. And it was largely forgotten about. For Vladimir Putin, the mindset seems to have been he can do what he wants in Ukraine and there will be little ramifications for it. Now, it's Putin's mindset that I'm going to talk a lot about today. And so that's why this is particularly important. One of the things I would really emphasize is that Vladimir Putin cares about history. The image here is of a meeting from soon after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, where Putin met with Macron. And there's all kinds of things. One could talk about the image, about the long table, which Putin apparently was a germaphobe and these sorts of things. But Macron's press conference after this meeting he said in the press conference that he felt that he got a history lecture from Vladimir Putin. And this is not surprising because Vladimir Putin, since the year 2000, has been talking about how Russians and Ukrainians are not two peoples, they're one people. In part because of our own feelings about history, we have not been listening. And in 2021, he wrote an essay called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. It lays out the entire rationale for the war, not just the 2014 war, but the 2022 invasion. There was soon after it came out, a New York Times opinion piece that said it's a boring essay. It may be a boring essay. He might not be a stimulating writer, but in fact, it does lay out the political ramifications for what he says. A lot of people have taken to saying, what does Vladimir Putin want, as if it's a mystery? It isn't. He keeps telling us exactly what he wants. We just don't listen. And this is a problem for us. So I want to talk about the history that Putin narrates. And in his essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, he does a really interesting thing, and it's a problematic one, because he uses some good historical evidence and then he twists his interpretation. And that's going to be a problem. And it's one of the ways that dictators and totalitarian rulers of the past have always used history. Certainly, we see it in the present in my country, where you've got people who say things from the past that are true and then apply a filter of logic or a filter of illogic that is going to shift the meaning. To understand what Putin wants, I want to start where he does, which is with the medieval history of the situation. Now, once upon a time in the 11th and 12th century, there was a kingdom in Eastern Europe called Rus. The kingdom of Rus was part and parcel of medieval Europe. There was a Rusian princess who was the Queen of France. There were ties all over medieval Europe, which we'll talk more about in just a few minutes. But this kingdom of Rus was a medieval kingdom, a medieval polity, if you will, a political entity. It was not the historical precursor of Russia, right? And this is where Putin's narrative diverges from what we know as the historical past. One of the problems we often have as modern people is when we look at medieval history, what we do is we try and find the historical origins of the present. In England is actually a really interesting area to talk about that, because the historical area, region, kingdom of England is startlingly similar to the present kingdom. And yet, that's not true everywhere. Germany doesn't exist as a country until the late 19th century. Italy is the same. In the medieval period, we've got Serbs and Croats. We don't necessarily have all the polity borders that we do at the present. And so Rus is one of those examples. We could say that Rus is the historical progenitor of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, but we certainly can't say that it solely belongs to Russia. And yet, Putin is fond of quoting one of our earliest chronicle sources from the Kingdom of Rus that says, Kiev is the mother of Russian cities. And in fact, it's actually kind of accurate. I would translate it as Kiev is the mother of the cities of Rus, right? It's a different kind of genitive form. But what we have is kind of the same thing, except for that Rus versus Russia, right? That's going to be one of the big differences there. In 2014, Vladimir Putin erected a statue of Saint Vladimir. Vladimir was the Christianizer of Rus in 988, 989, and he erected this statue in 2014, not coincidentally, the year of the invasion of Crimea, in Moscow. You can see him here giving a speech at the dedication. The patriarch is in the background. There's an identification of the Russian Orthodox Church with Vladimir Putin, which is part of this tie. And one of the most interesting little things about this war is that it is a war over Vladimir. Vladimir the Saint is often called Volodymyr when we go back and look at the contemporary medieval sources. But he shares a name with both Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. And so if you look at the two of them, you're seeing actually the very different derivations in modern Russian and modern Ukrainian of our historical medieval Volodymyr. And Ukrainians like to joke, there was a political cartoon that came out in 2014 when this statue was erected, that the statue came to life and he looked out on Moscow and he said, "Where am I?" Because, of course, Moscow was not a city, was not built during the time of St. Vladimir. And then Russians walking by the statue look up and say, "Who's that?" And so it's a really interesting dichotomy on why Putin is erecting this statue and what he's thinking about. So Putin is not the only one talking about this issue. His lecture on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians has become part of the training manual for the military forces and now has been integrated into the schooling. And we see that play out. A Russian soldier told a family in the Ukrainian city of Bucha that he was reclaiming the territory of Rus. So, he was actually taking their apartment. but he was thinking in the terms of history that Vladimir Putin has articulated. The Kingdom of Rus was interconnected with medieval Europe, as I noted. This is a map of dynastic marriages between the ruling family of Rus and the other ruling families of medieval Europe. There are a lot of them. And I mentioned briefly Anna Yaroslavna, daughter of Yaroslav the Wise. She marries Henry I and becomes the Queen of France. It's actually this Anna that introduces the name Philip into the royal line of the Capetians. So we think of Philip as such a French name, but actually this is going to come from Rus. We have a Danish queen who is from Rus, a Norwegian queen who is from Rus. We have this woman on the modern Ukrainian slide, Yevpraksia Vasilyovna, is the empress of the German Empire in this period. A famous name that you might know, Harald Hardrada, who invades England in 1066, right before William the Conqueror. His wife is a Rusian princess, sister to Anna, the Queen of France, daughter of the King of Rus in Kiev. So we've got all of these ties that make up medieval Europe. Rus is part and parcel of them. As the medieval period progresses, in the 12th and 13th centuries, we begin to see Rus go in different directions. And so one of the things we see, can you see my highlighter, Andrea? Yes? All right. So the region here in the Northeast is going to become the Moscow region. And it's not a fait accompli that Moscow takes over. There are a variety of rivals for power. However, this region down here, Galicia-Volhynia, is going to become what we might call a proto-Ukrainian region. So the Moscow region in the Northeast is going to become increasingly isolated. They'll have more ties to the east, more ties with the Mongols in the 13th century. We will see down here this region be deeply embedded in Hungarian and Polish politics. And even up here in the north with Novgorod, Novgorod becomes part of the Baltic system and engages in trade with the Hanseatic League, based out of Lübeck in northern Germany, or in the northern part of the German Empire. So that Kingdom of Rus is going to splinter into many different groups and go its own way. And yet, for a very long time, the Russians, drawing on the Muscovites, the people of Muscovy, will say that Rus was their sole heritage. And they will trace a line from Kiev, or even originally from Constantinople to Kiev to Moscow. And that will be their inheritance. And that's where we get the idea of Moscow as a third Rome. Where we eventually get to Ukraine, however, is not until much later, and that's in the 17th century. In the 17th century, we have a more complicated political situation. The map you'll see on the right still has Moscow on it, right? And Moscow is going to control a wide swath of territory from Novgorod in the north all the way to the Caspian Sea in the south. And that's going to be a good chunk of territory expanding east. On their west is a polity that we rarely even think about today, which is Poland-Lithuania. Poland and Lithuania became joined beginning in the 14th century, and they are going to control a large part of what used to be the Kingdom of Rus. The territory of the Dnieper River here, with Kiev at its center, used to be the center of Rus, and now you can see it's divided between territory controlled by Moscow and territory controlled by Poland-Lithuania. This map, even though it is hundreds of years old, is emblematic of what we see in Ukraine still today, and certainly in the first decade of the 21st century. Pardon me. Ukrainians tend to think of themselves based around orientation along the Dnieper River. And when we talk about river orientations, typically we talk about the way the river flows. And so they don't talk about east and west. They look south along the Dnieper, flowing into the Black Sea. And so if you can imagine yourself 100 feet high, straddling the river, looking to the south, there's the left bank Dnieper, which is to the east, and the right bank Dnieper, which is to the west. And just as you see on this map, the left bank Dnieper has much stronger Russian ties, Russian language ties, and the right bank Dnieper to the west has stronger Polish ties, has stronger Polish linguistic ties in particular. And so there is that divide that has persisted through Ukrainian history from the 17th century to the present. The 17th century is also the time we first see the name Ukraine on a map. Ukraine exists as a name, and it means in Slavic borderland. And many of you may remember after 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, we referred to in the West Ukraine for a long time as the Ukraine. And about the year 2000, Ukrainians began pushing back and saying, it's not the Ukraine, it's Ukraine. And the reason they did that is because Ukraine means borderland. And so if we're talking about the borderland, we inherently have to have it as the borderland of somewhere. And that somewhere is Russia. And they didn't want to constantly be identified as the borderland of Russia. And so that's going to be a really important change that they were trying to make in their own self-representation. Now, the importance of the 17th century is not just in solidifying these two regions of left and right bank Ukraine, but because we're going to begin to see Poland, Lithuania, and Russia go to war over the Dnieper River Valley. Now, this period is one of conflict. The people who were kind of stuck in the middle, but also in control of their own destiny in a certain way, are the Cossacks. And the Cossacks are a group that lives on the steppe. The steppe is the rolling grasslands north of the Black Sea, north of the Caspian Sea, and extend roughly all the way to modern Mongolia. They're a highway across Eurasia for nomadic pastoralists. So the Cossacks, once upon a time, were themselves descended from nomadic pastoralists, but over time had a hearty leavening of people who wanted to get away from either Poland, Lithuania, or Russia. The Cossacks typically are associated with river regions, so we see them on the Dnieper, though instead of calling them the Dnieper Cossacks, we call them the Zaporozhian Cossacks. We do this because there are a series of rapids on the Dnieper, and they're named after those rapids. But we also will later see Don Cossacks and Volga Cossacks, and Ural, here's the Ural Cossacks. Actually, they're Yike Cossacks. Ural is a change that Catherine the Great makes. The one Cossack leader that we really need to pay attention to right at this moment is named Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And this is the moment at which I know that you're grateful that you're listening to this for your own edification and not taking a class, so you don't have to remember how to spell Bogdan Khmelnytsky on my test. So Bogdan is the hetman, right, which is the leader or head man of the Zaporozhian Cossacks. Many of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, and he's a handsome fellow. Here's his picture. So there's Bogdan Khmelnytsky. So Bogdan Khmelnytsky is the leader of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, and they are unhappy with Polish rule. They're unhappy for a variety of reasons, but particularly they thought Poland was taking away their rights and was oppressing them, particularly oppressing their Orthodox religion. The Poles traditionally were Catholic. The Orthodox Russians wanted to stick up for the Orthodox Cossacks. So in 1648, Bogdan Khmelnytsky led a revolt against Poland. A couple of years, they do pretty well. They kill a lot of Poles. They also kill a lot of Jews. This is the whole story of anti-Semitism woven into a lot of this region's history. But Khmelnytsky's campaign fell on tough times, and so he appealed to the Russian Tsar Alexei, for assistance. Alexei and his advisors were not quite ready for a war with Poland, but they've been consistently complaining about how the Poles treated their Orthodox subjects. And so when those very same Orthodox subjects were asking for help, they felt that they could not turn down that request for assistance. So in January of 1654, Bogdan Khmelnytsky and Tsar Alexei signed an agreement, and that agreement is known as the Treaty of Pereyaslav. Right, and so here's the Treaty of Pereyaslav. I put that up there. The Treaty of Pereyaslav is an important moment because it is understood very differently by the two signatories. Bogdan Khmelnytsky understood the agreement as saying that Russia would help the Cossacks earn their freedom. And even though the treaty says that he pledges eternal loyalty to Tsar Alexei, he took that in a very, in a more ephemeral kind of way. Tsar Alexei viewed it quite differently. He believed that because he was giving aid to the Cossacks, that he was now in control of them, and whatever land he and his forces, including Khmelnytsky, took, he would keep. Now, I know it seems odd for us to even think about these things in these terms, but the Treaty of Pereyaslav is still highly relevant to this conflict today. The Cossacks were bolstered by the Russians. They were able to eventually even sack Vilna. Vilna would be the capital of Poland, Lithuania. And eventually what we're going to get to is a truce of Andrusovo in 1667. And that truce is going to add a good amount of territory to Russia. And we will see that the ruler of Moscow, the Tsar, is going to take a new title for himself at this time. He calls himself sovereign of all Great, Little, and White Russia. Right, so Great Russia is what we traditionally think of as Russia. Little Russia is a Great Russian name for Ukraine, and White Russia is the literal translation of Belarus. Right, Belarus is White Russia. He doesn't actually rule any of Belarus, and he only rules part of Ukraine, but he creates this image of himself as the ruler of all of those territories at this time in the middle of the 17th century. Khmelnytsky's successors never fully accepted Muscovite rule. They kept causing problems for the Russians. We are going to see that for the next several hundred years. But to jump forward a little bit, we'll go one more, to the Battle of Poltava in the 18th century. So this is a battle fought by Peter the Great, a famous Russian ruler whom you've all heard of. Peter the Great's best known, of course, for reaching out to the west, for creating St. Petersburg and the Russian Navy. But he's involved for a long time in a war that's called the Great Northern War with King Charles XII of Sweden. This war also involves Poland, Lithuania, and the Cossacks. And this war is declared with Sweden in 1700 and lasts for 21 years off and on. It's kind of the last major role that the Swedes play in world history as well. I mean, outside of hockey. So Peter controlled the left bank of Ukraine, but not most of the right bank. And even the Zaporozhian Cossacks, who were ostensibly on his side, well, they really weren't. The key figure in this is a Cossack named Ivan Mazepa. And Mazepa was the hetman of the left bank Cossack. So that means he was the Eastern Cossack leader, so in the territory that was controlled by the Russians. Lest you think that Mazepa is a sword-wielding thug, he is a major landowner. He's a patron of the arts. In fact, the Kiev Mohyla Academy today, which is one of the premier universities in Kiev, was endowed by him with additional resources and caused it to grow immensely. So Mazepa is a major figure for Ukrainian nationalists. In 1702, Mazepa secured permission from Peter the Great to assist the right bank Cossacks, those that are on the west, in their revolt against Poland. Things came to a head roughly in 1708 when Peter was expecting a massive Swedish assault on Moscow itself from King Charles XII. Peter ordered all of his troops, including Mazeppa and the Cossacks, to defend Moscow. Their absence from the Dnieper region allowed the Polish king, who was an ally of Charles XII, and the Polish king, for those of you keeping score at home, was Stanislaus Leszczynski. Again, lucky you don't have to spell that. Mazeppa claimed that this was a violation of the Treaty of Pereyaslav. So if you recall, the Treaty of Pereyaslav signed in 1654, right? But now in 1708, we are seeing actually that a Cossack hetman is saying, look, this treaty that was signed 60 years ago, you are violating that treaty. So this is still present in their minds. So Mazeppa made a fateful decision and he defected. He took 3,000 of his Cossacks with him and he went over to the side of the Poles and the Swedes. Peter, of course, viewed this as traitorous behavior. And Peter had also solidified his control over the Orthodox Church. And he, in fact, subordinated the Orthodox Church to the government. He created it as a bureau within the government. And so because he had done that, he had Mazeppa declared anathema outside the bounds of his church. His soldiers could be and were, in fact, killed in a brutal manner. And Peter appointed a new hetman, a guy named Ivan Skoropadsky, to be loyal to him. Mazeppa and his forces fought at this Battle of Poltava in 1709. Peter's army was numerically superior. King Charles XII was injured. And in fact, there's a whole lot. I'm not a military historian, but it's one of these really important military battles because we see artillery used to soften up the target before the cavalry charge, which is going to become, of course, a much more common thing. But Poltava becomes a turning point in the war. Russians, in fact, still talk about the glories of Poltava. They defeat the Swedish army. They send King Charles XII and Mazeppa fleeing to the Ottoman Turks. The Russians take more land along the Baltic. And the last thing it does is it really establishes Russia on the European political scene. The Europeans were all of a sudden astounded at Peter's victory over the Swedes. And they were a little bit worried about what would happen then. And it's worth noting, you see here an official of King George I says at this time, Germany and the entire North have never been in such grave peril as now, because the Russians should be feared more than the Turks and are gradually advancing closer and closer to our lives. Right? So what did they do? They beat the Swedes and the Poles at Poltava, but the threat is felt as far as England, and the Russians are being compared to the Turks. And this is, of course, a religious divide as well. The Turks were always the worst enemy because they were Muslim. But now we've got the Orthodox Russians on par with the Turks at this time, too. Now, Mazeppa's legacy is mixed. There we go. Mazeppa's legacy is mixed. His name was used as a curse for Ukrainian nationalists in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Russian Orthodox Church excommunicates him. But in 19th century Ukraine, he was absolutely idolized. Mikhail Pogodin, who's a famous Russian scholar, wrote in 1822 that, quote, the little Russians call themselves the true Russians, or what I would say, translate that as Russians, and the others Moskali. They do not entirely like them. Muscovy was something apart. They love Mazeppa, right? And I've pictured here the 10 hryvnia note, which has Mazeppa's picture on it. And so this quote from Pogodin, I think, says a lot of things. So again, Pogodin, as a Russian, is calling the Ukrainians little Russians, but acknowledges that they think of themselves as the true Russians or true Russians, and the others are Moskali, which would be Muscovites, right? People from Moscow. But even beyond talking about ethnicity, he zeroes in on the fact that they love Mazeppa, right? So Mazeppa maintains a key role here. Even in modern Russia today, if you mention Mazeppa, a lot of people will view him as a traitor. And again, this goes back to the 1654 Treaty of Pereyaslav all again. So it's so interesting how this history lives on. All right, so continuing our progress through history, we can talk a little bit about a process called Russification. Russification in the 19th century was an idea where everybody had to become Russian in the Russian Empire. And this is true in a variety of places. We see that same kind of ethnic conformity happening, Polonification in Poland, etc., in a later period. But Alexander III and Nicholas II really launched this policy of Russification. And the Ukrainians, of course, take a big role here. So the book title I've given you on the side is titled Lemberg, Lvov, Lviv, 1914 to 1917. And this is one city. It's a city that goes by a German name, it goes by a Russian name, and it goes by a Ukrainian name. The people who live there the whole time are Ukrainian. The whole time they call their city in their own language Lviv. But depending on who was occupying the city, they had to go by whatever that conqueror's name was. And so it's actually a pretty interesting little example for some of these things to see that difference. In World War I, Russification became such an overriding priority that when we see General Brusilov advance into Galicia, which is Ukrainian territory held by Austria-Hungary, one of the things that he does is he is going to impose Russification. So they'll close Ukrainian churches, they'll suppress the Ukrainian language, and they'll even change street signs. And this is so important that they do those things, but Brusilov never solidifies his advance by setting up enough guard stations. And so the Germans are able to drive him out very quickly. And you know, there's a whole World War I conversation there where if the Russians and the Austro-Hungarians fought each other, it might be a Pyrrhic victory for the Russians. It's the Germans who really turn that table. But of course, this war doesn't end for the Russians. It is going to be subsumed into the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, the creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. This is messy for Ukraine. Ukraine becomes divided between the what we call the RSFSR, the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, and Poland. So parts of it become held by Poland. These parts here become part of Poland in a brief war that takes place in 1919 and 1920 and settled in 21 at the Treaty of Riga. Those are territories that are often called Western Ukraine and Western Belarus. And so those are going to be important here as well. They will become part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact Treaty of 1939. In the early 1920s, a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was created, but this was not the first choice for most Ukrainians. Most Ukrainians wanted to form some kind of democratic government, and so they created a parliament called a Rada in Ukrainian, in which decreed Ukrainian independence in 1917. The first leader of this Rada is Mikhailo Khrushchevsky. I am a huge fan of Mikhailo Khrushchevsky, and I've worked on his work. He is a historian, and he is, in fact, started as a medieval historian, and he wrote this massive multi-volume series of the history of Ukraine Rus. And so, you know, maybe you could go farther wrong than electing a medieval historian as your first leader. I think that would work out pretty nicely. But to fight this democratic organization, the Soviets created a capital of their own in Kharkiv. All right, so here's Kharkiv. And the reason I point this out is because it is deep in left bank Ukraine. This is territory that is much more historically oriented towards Russia. The group in Kharkiv in Ukrainian, Kharkov in Russian, will win out, and we will see the formation of the Ukrainian SSR. So we do get this Ukrainian SSR, and we're going to see various bits and pieces added to it, as you can see on the map. So with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, we will see the addition of Western Ukraine added in 1939. We'll see a piece of Moldova added in 1940. And the big one to pay attention to is down here, and this is Crimea, which is added in 1954. In 1954, Nikita Khrushchev is going to administratively transfer Crimea from the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. This is meaningless in the USSR because it is still controlled by the USSR. However, at the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, it was administratively attached to Ukraine, and so it became part of Ukraine. And so one of the rationales for Putin's invasion in 2014 was to take back Crimea, which was really Russian, right? Well, that was the argument. 1954 is not a coincidence, though. 1954 is the 300th anniversary of the Treaty of Pereyaslav. And I know I keep harping on the Treaty of Pereyaslav, but this is still why this is important. Khrushchev was honoring the Treaty of Pereyaslav and saying, on the 300th anniversary of the joining of Russians and Ukrainians, we're giving Crimea back to the Ukrainians, right? So there is this longue durée version of history that's happening here. What we see in the 1930s is we see the advent of collectivization. Collectivization was when Stalin launched a massive program to create collective farms. No more independently owned farms, no capitalist model, right? Everything would be owned all together. This is one of the most formative moments in the formation of modern Ukrainian identity, because the Ukrainians call this time the Holodomor, the starving time. They do this because they believe, with very good evidence, that Stalin's collectivization program was directed in part at killing off, quite literally, Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian nationalists. Ukraine then, as now, or at least before the war, was a breadbasket of a country, and it supplied grain all over the Soviet Union, as it supplied grain to most of Europe. However, during the Holodomor, during the collectivization period, we see a variety of decrees, and I've highlighted one of them here. In December of 1932, Stalin signed a decree called on the procurement of grain in Ukraine, the North Caucasus, and the Western region. The purpose of the increased grain procurement was not, in fact, to feed the rest of the Soviet Union, but it was to continue grain exports of the Soviet Union, which were going to provide hard currency for the increasing industrialization program. However, despite its title, this decree does not focus solely on grain. It also orders the arrest of quote-unquote saboteurs in those areas. It specifically includes 14 named individuals, all of whom were Ukrainian nationalists. Culture is attacked as well. Ukrainian was to be removed as the language of correspondence and instruction and replaced by Russian, and Ukrainian nationalists were sought out, punished, and imprisoned. In addition to taking their grain, the Soviet government erected barriers, physical blockades to prevent aid from going into Ukrainian towns and villages. Now, this is not like earlier famines. For instance, in 1921, during the famine, Herbert Hoover, who will eventually become the president of the United States, launches assistance to the Soviet Union under the American Relief Administration, the ARA, and Lenin let him in to help feed the starving people. This time, the request for aid or for the ability to help was denied. 4 million people died in Ukraine during this period. Over the entire USSR, we see 5 to 7 million. So the vast majority are in Ukraine. Now, the legacy of this issue is immense. Ukrainians view this as a genocide, an attempt to kill off Ukrainians in general, and specifically those who had a desire for independence. The Russians, when discussing the event, typically talk about how it affected a variety of places in the Soviet Union, not just Ukraine. So was it a genocide? Well, no, not according to the United Nations definition. But if we follow the logic of Anne Applebaum in her book, Red Famine, we can note that the technical definition of genocide, which is held by the United Nations, was drafted in part by the Soviet Union, and that the Soviet Union focused attempts during those debates on narrowing the definition to include Nazis, acts committed by the Nazis and by racists, not by what they were doing in particular. And in fact, the lawyer who initially began construction of the United Nations Convention of 1948 on genocide, a guy named Lemkin, Raphael Lemkin, he wrote in 1952 an article called The Soviet Genocide in Ukraine, right? So he believed it was a genocide. I've included as well this map on the Holodomor, and this is from the MAPA project at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and it is just one of hundreds of maps that they have where you can look at all kinds of different things related to the Holodomor and what's going on at this time in the 1930s in Ukraine. If we move to the Second World War and past, we get to one of the most curious claims made by Vladimir Putin, and that's that he was engaged in the denazification of Ukraine. The idea that Ukraine was run by Nazis or Nazi elements or fascists dates back to World War II. In the 1920s and 30s, there were fascist groups operating almost in every country in Europe, as well as the United States. Not only the National Socialists in Germany, there were Italian fascists, of course, but also the Iron Guard in Romania, the Arrow Cross Party in Hungary. And in Ukraine, we saw an organization of Ukrainian nationalists, the OUN. The OUN split and splintered, as many of these groups will. And after the Nazi-Soviet pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, the OUN began collaborating with the Nazis. They were particularly interested in undermining the Soviet Union, and their goal was, of course, the creation of an independent Ukrainian state. Once Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the OUN declared an independent Ukraine with a capital in Lviv. Now, again, if we can go back to our map for just a minute, Lviv is all the way over in western Ukraine. It's going to be in the territory that we call right bank Ukraine. So you can see how far west it is. So when the Soviets were looking for something, they created a capital here at Kharkov, right? And then here we see the OUN at Lviv. So these are the two poles of what we're talking about. Now, Hitler actually didn't care about the OUN and their goals. And so Stepan Bandera, who you see pictured here, was one of the leaders of the most nationalist factions, and he was sent to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Both of his brothers died at Auschwitz, and Bandera was released from Sachsenhausen in 1944. The OUN did not initially have any kind of anti-Semitic agenda, but they did participate with the SS in the killing of thousands of Jews on Ukrainian territory. But even more than that, they killed tens of thousands of Poles, mostly women and children, to remove them from what they viewed as Ukrainian territory. And so the reason Bandera was released in 1944 was to become a tool for the Nazis to foment discord inside of the Soviet Union, which he did, even after their retreat. And so the OUN, through their insurgent army, is going to continue fighting. They kill Poles, they kill Russians, they kill Jews, most anybody who isn't Ukrainian, on a mission to create a Ukrainian state that was independent. Sadly, in the post-World War II period, Bandera and the OUN were aided by both England and the United States as a way to support fomenting discord inside of the Soviet Union. Eventually, Bandera was assassinated in the 1950s. Now, the legacy of the OUN is immense. In post-1991 Ukraine, the OUN became a sponsor of a political party and has played a very small role in elections, getting less than 1% of the vote, far less than we see with like AfD in Germany, right? Alternative for Deutschland. But in the minds of Putin, this organization is behind the 2014 Maidan demonstrations that ousted his favored candidate, Viktor Yanukovych. And in fact, Yanukovych's ouster at the Maidan was because he refused to sign the EU association agreement. This became more complicated too when the guy who ousted Yanukovych, Viktor Yushchenko, gave Bandera the title of Hero of Ukraine. And so this is going to create a lot of problems. And in fact, we still see, as pictured here, a monument to Stepan Bandera erected in the 21st century. So this is causing a really rather big problem in terms of what's happening. All right, I just want to mention something real quick by way of bringing things to a close. There's an idea in Russian history called encirclement, the idea that the Russians believe that they're encircled by powers who are out to get them. The picture shown here is of United States soldiers in Vladivostok after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. When I teach Russian history in America, approximately 0% of my students know that the American army was ever in Russia at this time. But in fact, the Americans had troops in Vladivostok, but also in the far north at Arkhangelsk. The British sent a whole battalion to Vladivostok. They supplied arms and armor and weapons, or arms and armor and clothes to the whites who were opposed to the Reds. And in Russia, every Russian I've ever met knows that they were invaded at this time. So that's part of this mentality of encirclement. And I mention this to lead into NATO. Why does Putin care so much about NATO? Well, NATO, of course, is founded in 1949 to oppose the Soviet Union. But the first NATO Secretary General, Lord Ismay, made a very pithy quote about its purpose: to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. I think this is just a great representation of what it is. He doesn't identify it as the Soviet Union. He calls them the Russians. He wants to keep the Russians out, very similar to the official of George I, who was talking about the fear of the Russians, to keep the Americans in, which is to say involved, which is a good point because we're terrible allies to have sometimes, as former President Trump has pointed out recently, and then the Germans down, right? So this is a really important moment. And in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, NATO, whose stated purpose was to fight the Soviet Union, probably should have gone along with it. But instead, it didn't. And instead, NATO expanded. Former American Secretary of State James Baker noted that NATO expansion was not handled well, right? And this is a little bit of an understatement. Putin, by the time he came to power in late 99, saw NATO as a threat. And if we can return to the idea of encirclement, NATO when it's created here in blue versus NATO today, right, with Sweden and Finland in light blue as their status is still under consideration. The growth of NATO is entirely to the east. It is entirely to the Russian border, and the threat is directed at Russia. Ukraine is not the only place that Russia has caused problems in the 21st century. They have a frozen conflict zone in Transnistria down here with Moldova, which has kept Moldova from being able to join the EU. They invaded Georgia to create a frozen conflict zone with Abkhazia and Ossetia, so that Georgia could not participate in the EU. And now they've invaded and taken approximately a fifth of the territory, inclusive of Crimea, of Ukraine, which will stop Ukraine from being able to join the EU as well, because of the provisions about what are called frozen conflict zones. So my job is to present history, right? And so I've presented the history. I'm happy to prognosticate and make guesses if you want and questions, but I'll stop there and open the floor up. Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it.
Wow. You're mute, Andrea.
There's always one, isn't there? Christian, thanks very much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm
so
sure we'll
glad.
have some questions coming in a moment. In the meantime, I will just stop the recording.